From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy lay out their plans for a new Department of Government Efficiency. But what and how much can they accomplish from outside the federal bureaucracy and without the help of Congress? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Alicia Finley and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. In an announcement earlier this month that he knew would make some news, Donald Trump said he was excited to work with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy in a new Department of Government Efficiency, which would be outside of the government despite its name, but would work on streamlining federal agencies. Trump said it will become potentially the Manhattan Project of our time. Republican politicians have dreamed about the objectives of DOGE for a very long time. He also said that this Department of Government Efficiency would wrap up its work by July 4th, 2026. Let's listen to Mr. Ramaswamy on Fox News Sunday last week, explaining what he intends to accomplish.
So first is we want to go right in through executive action to do the failures of the executive branch that need to be addressed. Because the dirty little secret right now, Maria, is the people we elect to run the government, they're not the ones who actually run the government. It's the unelected bureaucrats in the administrative state. That was created through executive action. It's going to be fixed through executive action. Think about the Supreme Court's environment over the last several years. They've held that many of those regulations are unconstitutional at a large scale. Rescind those regulations, pull those regs back, and then that gives us the industrial logic to then downsize the size of that administrative state. And the beauty of all of this is that can be achieved just through executive action without Congress.
The Washington Post reports this week that the DOGE crew is now seeking staff, interviewing seasoned Washington operators, legal specialists, and top tech leaders, unquote. Alicia, what do you make of this proposal and the case that Mr. Ramaswamy made there that the DOGE could have some effect on these agencies in Washington?
Look, I think there's a lot of truth to the fact that these agencies are bloated, both in terms of workforce and in terms of their spending. The federal workforce has increased by about 120,000 over the Biden presidency. A lot of that has been actually at the Veterans Affairs and hospitals. But if you look at every agency, it's increased by about 10 to 20%. And one of the reasons is because they've been issuing more regulations. And so you need more employees to write these regulations. But they've also been taking more enforcement actions against businesses. And when I talk about enforcement actions, basically bringing complaints, businesses often agree to settle these complaints regardless of whether they have merit, and by paying, $10-20 million token penalty, that ends up actually just funding the bureaucracy even more. And so one of the tasks of this DOGE committee would be to just reduce the regulation in that way, also reduce the size of bureaucracy. But what you also have to do is to actually lay off some of these employees. And there are various ways to do that. As they have suggested, you could threaten or require them to come back to the office 5 days a week. Many may not want to do that. I mean, I think Musk or Vivek has suggested that you could actually just reduce the size of the federal workforce 25%. Just by doing a return to the office mandate. Now, actually, there's a hilarious case where the NLRB, that's the National Labor Relations Board, sued the gay dating app Grindr for imposing a return to the office mandate, which it alleged was intended to make workers who were trying to unionize quit. And it was actually quite successful in that. And 80% of the workers, all of a sudden, when they had to come back to the office, quit as a result. So I think there is one way of doing it. You can also just do a reduction in force. So across the board layoffs, maybe provide some kind of severance package for these workers, Vivek has suggested, so to kind of cushion the blow. But I think you do need to eliminate these quote unquote make work projects that these government employees are doing. And by make work, it's really make work regulations.
One thing that I think the DOGE might want to do is to manage expectations. And there have been some very high promises that have been circulating. Elon Musk has suggested that the U.S. government might be able to cut $2 trillion And without getting into entitlement programs, Medicare, Social Security, I think the numbers on that just don't add up. They're also suggesting, Monet, that they don't want to get involved with Congress, even though there may be some congressional committees set up to support what this Department of Government Efficiency is doing and to look into its suggestions and recommendations. But that imposes some real limitations on what this effort might be able to produce, because to pick one example that Republicans have talked about for a long time, abolishing the Department of Education, there are some things that the Department of Education might be able to do through regulation, but closing up shop is not one of them. That would really require an act of Congress. So there are some limitations on what the eventual result of this effort might be, even if they do have some success through the regulatory sphere.
Yeah, I think that Elon and Vivek's philosophy here has been to shoot for the stars and to aim high, with the understanding that they're not likely to accomplish nearly all of what they've put forward. I think that you've already started to see them adjust how they're describing DOGE's purview from the wildest plans that they made when it was first being announced in the Wall Street Journal op-ed that they co-authored. The figure that they put out, I believe, was $500 billion. So that was already quite a significant reduction from the $2 trillion that they had originally professed. Even that would be very ambitious. But the idea is they want to say, we are setting a very, very high target and are going to be able to cut and reform more than any of the previous blue ribbon government commissions have been able to do. I think the reason why they have decided to work minimally with Congress is because, of course, for any of the major reforms that they would like to do, you have the filibuster impediment there. So you know that they're not really going to get any Democratic Party sign-on to these things if they wanted to eliminate regulations through Congress, or if they wanted to eliminate an entire department like the Department of Education. There's no way that they would be able to potentially pass that. The best focus that they have is on putting together a whole list of executive actions, rescinding rules, getting executive orders put through. And I do think that they are going to be able to hire a lot of very talented lawyers and a lot of policymakers from some of these agencies who will be able to point the way to a lot of the low-hanging fruit there and streamline the legal process for rolling back a lot of this administrative action much more efficiently than President Trump was able to do in his first term, which was also quite successful in a lot of areas of deregulation.
This op-ed that Musk and Ramaswamy wrote in the Journal about a week ago goes through some of their thinking. Here's one line that sticks out. It says, the two of us will advise DOGE at every step to pursue three major kinds of reform: regulatory rescissions, administrative reductions, and cost savings. And Alicia, the regulatory piece of this is interesting because Trump will also have his own cabinet officials at the head of these regulatory agencies doing their own kinds of reviews of these kinds of rules. But notable too that often takes time. It takes analysis. There's a process set up by law for how cabinet agencies and regulatory bodies are supposed to go about enacting or repealing these kinds of rules. The Administrative Procedure Act of 1946. And the point of this law is to ensure that there is reasoned decision making by the federal government. And so one phrase that you often hear in litigation is arbitrary and capricious. If there's a regulation that a regulated entity challenges and says, hang on, you're imposing this kind of regulation on me, and you guys didn't go through the process and do the kind of analysis to show that the benefits of this regulation outweigh the cost of this regulation. And those kind of lawsuits don't always succeed, but sometimes they do. And so if these agencies are going to go through and try to rip up some of their regulations and some of their rules, it might take a while. And part of why I think that's interesting is the deadline that this DOGE is setting for itself of about a year and a half. They want to be at this operation only until the summer of 2026.
Well, that's right. And a lot of these rules have already been stayed by the courts, which is helpful. What Trump can do is pause enforcement of these rules while they go through the APA process. And the APA process is usually you have to provide public notice so that you can collect public comments on the rules. and the rescission of the rules. And often you have to propose an alternative then or a new rule. And when you go through this, yes, you mentioned that you have to do a cost-benefit analysis. You also have to consider the reliance interests of all the different interest groups, businesses, et cetera, who have started to comply with the old rules. You also have to consider alternatives to the rule that you're proposing. And this can be an unwieldy process that can take years, as it did during the first Trump administration. Hence why you actually didn't get many, not just the rescissions, but the proposed new rules finalized until the final days of the Trump administration, because it actually took 4 years from the time that they started. And part of that also was it took a little more time to get the Trump cabinet nominees in place. And I don't think that will be as big of an issue problem this time around. But yes, it takes time. You're gonna see more lawsuits, and the liberal groups will probably sue in friendly jurisdictions like the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and the First Circuit of Court, where they have more liberal judges. And you may see injunctions barring the Trump administration from actually rolling back these rules. And you're going to have to take these to potentially the Supreme Court. Under the APA, an agency must simply provide what is known as, quote unquote, a reasoned analysis. But you've often seen judges flyspeck, for instance, environmental impact statements, say, well, you didn't analyze the carbon emissions from downstream production of natural gas pipelines or natural gas drilling. And this actually isn't what judges are supposed to do. They're just basically supposed to say, well, you did go through all these steps and you did a reasoned analysis, and we're not going to quibble or second guess you. But that hasn't been what judges did during the first Trump administration. I think that that's going to be a real obstacle to rolling back some of the rules in the second Trump administration.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back. All of those limitations stated, though, one optimistic view might be that Elon and Vivek will be a second set of eyes on these kinds of regulations, looking through what not only the Trump cabinet is doing, but what they might not be doing. The op-ed in the Journal by Elon and Vivek is also leaning on recent Supreme Court rulings, suggesting that there are areas where the Biden administration has overreached on regulations. It then has this line: DOGE will work with legal experts embedded in government agencies, aided by advanced technology, to apply these rulings to federal regulations enacted. It will present this list of regulations to President Trump, who can, by executive action, immediately pause the enforcement. And Monet, again, going back to the optimistic case, it's possible that some of the things that DOGE flags as unneeded regulations that are adding to the Washington bureaucracy are things that have political constituencies and are difficult for a president or an agency to repeal. And so that in that sense, they might be successful in adding some ambition, some outside ambition to what the Trump administration is able to do. And one thing that I would point to is something that President Trump seems to like: Buy America rules. There are all sorts of Buy America rules, some of them in law, but then encouraged by executive orders, putting strings on projects that are funded with federal money. And then often you can go through the agencies and find examples where some project is being done and it is just impractical for that product to be bought American. And so then the bureaucrats have to go through and do some kind of waiver, filling up the Federal Register. Here's one from the Department of Transportation, April 2024, waiving Buy America requirements on iron, steel, manufactured products for projects in the Pacific Island territories. So it turns out that it is a little bit difficult to get U.S. steel to Guam and American Samoa for these projects to comply with these Buy America mandates. So that's a spot where what the DOGE is suggesting and urging on President Trump might be different from what his normal instincts would be. And there, in cases like that, it might be able to do some real good.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the amount of heft that Elon and Vivek will be able to bring to the deregulatory process. They're promising to hire a staff of lawyers. Interviews are already beginning. They're promising to deploy AI to review these complex regulations and look for the lowest hanging fruit. I do think that that will help to take on, as you said, some of the embedded constituencies who benefit from these regulations, who have very large and formidable legal teams of their own in place to defend them. Of course, there is a potential downside in the courtroom, too, of the fact that a lot of these more liberal judges, as Alicia alluded to, in the First and Ninth Circuits are going to see this focused effort to repeal these regulations and probably are going to want to try even harder to oppose them the same way they did in the first Trump term, because they feel that they will be trying to stop a devious part of Donald Trump's agenda. So that the attention on DOGE and the amount of muscle behind this deregulatory effort could end up being a wash in that regard. I do think that, there are massive thickets in terms of the complexities of some of these rules that they'll be addressing. And there are definitely conservatives who do benefit from or favor a lot of the waivers that you see coming from executive agencies and things like that. I do think that they probably have too wide of a purview to be able to give close attention to the exact effects and the exact constituencies behind every single one of the rules that they're going to key up for potential repeal. And so there will be examples of ones that they do propose being rescinded, when you'll see a whole bunch of companies come out of the woodwork and calling the White House and seeing whether they can actually get exemptions on those. And you wonder whether they will be determined enough to fight against constituencies that the Republican Party happens to value, as opposed to merely targeting more liberal beneficiaries and interest groups. I do think that, just like any government process, there are going to be plenty of carve-outs and favors involved. But that doesn't mean that the broad ambition and the broad sweep of it, of rolling back a lot of overregulation on things like workplace safety, on things like the environment and emissions, isn't an overall beneficial goal for the American economy. And I think that when all said and done, it's very likely that the state of regulation is going to have improved compared with what would have happened in a Trump term without having this large focus on it, led by very capable and concentrated folks.